I want to tell you about the morning. Lord Westerby rode his horse down a coastal road in the autumn of 1823 and saw something that stopped him as surely as if the ground had opened up beneath him, because what he saw from that clifftop above the harbour at Rowanmere was not what he had come to find, and it shook something loose inside him that had been stuck in place for 2 long, ugly years. His name was Lord Callum Westerby, Viscount of Ravenscroft, and he had ridden north from London, in the grip of a shame he could not name out loud, which is its own particular kind of suffering. He had told himself he was coming on business. His men of business had been badgering him for months about the accounts from the northern properties, and there were questions he could not answer by letter. He told himself that. He believed it, or tried to, the way proud men try to believe the comfortable story rather than the true one. The true one was simpler and worse. He had wronged his wife past all decent reckoning, and somewhere in the rubble of his pride he had found, at last, that he could not live with it. He had banished her 2 years before. Sent her north to Rowanmere, a half-dead fishing village on the cold grey coast, the most miserable scrap of property in his possession, chosen deliberately for its misery, because that is the kind of man he had been then. He had meant to bury her there. He had meant to let the salt wind and the silence and the utter desolation grind her down until she was small enough that he could forget her, until London forgot her, until the whole wretched chapter of the Viscount of Ravenscroft's inconvenient wife could be quietly closed. He had not written, he had not visited. He had meant, if he was being honest with himself, and this road north had a way of demanding honesty, to never see her again. He reached the clifftop above Rowanmere at mid-morning, and he pulled his horse up short, and he looked down at the harbour, and everything he had prepared himself to see was simply not there. He remembered Rowanmere. He had seen it once, years before, when he acquired it along with a parcel of other neglected properties from a debt-ridden estate. A dying place even then. The harbour had been silting up for a generation. The fishing boats, what remained of them, were old and poorly kept. The quayside buildings were salt-rotted, the roads unpaved, the people, perhaps 100 souls, wearing the particular grey look of folk who have been forgotten by everyone with the power to help them and have long since stopped expecting otherwise. He had sent his wife there to cease along with it. What lay below him now was not that place. The harbour had been dredged. He could see by the lines of the water, the depth of it, the size of the vessels riding at anchor. And there were real vessels in it, trading vessels, 2 of them being loaded at the quay with the brisk organized efficiency of a working port that knows exactly what it is about. The quayside buildings had been repaired, rebuilt in some cases, new timber, fresh paint, a warehouse that had not existed 2 years ago. The road up from the village was paved now, properly paved, with carts moving along it. He could see a new fish-curing house, a cooperage, what appeared to be a small textile works built against the hill, its chimney breathing steadily into the morning air. The village itself had the settled, purposeful look of a community that is not dying but thriving, which is a thing you can see from a distance if you know what to look for. The way good harbour towns have an energy that runs all the way up to the clifftop and meets you there. Lord Westerby sat his horse and stared, and made no sense of it until his eye found the quay. There was a woman on the quay. She stood at the stern of the nearer vessel with a manifest in one hand, and her other hand pointing at the cargo, at the riggers, at something being loaded that did not satisfy her, and every man within 50 yards was attending to what she said with the close, willing attention of people who have learned that she is almost always right. She was not dressed for London, she was dressed for work. A plain dark coat, sensible boots, her hair up and severe under a practical hat. She looked like a woman who had things to accomplish before noon and intended to accomplish them all. And Lord Callum Westerby, Viscount of Ravenscroft, recognized his wife. I am going to stop us right there, with Lord Westerby frozen on that cliff top, and his wife 20 feet below on the dock of the thriving harbour she had built in the ruin he left her. Because before I tell you how she built it, and what he did when he came down from that cliff, you and I have our arrangement. If you have not yet subscribed to Moonlight at Marlowe, now is the moment. It costs you nothing. It takes 10 seconds. And there are a great many more of these. Stories about quiet, remarkable people doing extraordinary things in the wreckage of what they were handed. And I would hate for you to miss a single one. Find the button and press it. The story will wait. Good stories always do. Now, let me take you back, as I must, to the beginning. Come with me. You will want to know exactly what she came from before you understand what she built. Clara Finch was the only child of Mr. Samuel Finch of Baltimore. And that alone ought to tell you something about her. Samuel Finch had started with nothing. A merchant's apprenticeship at 14, a small cargo stake at 22, and a mind so precisely suited to the movement of goods and trust that by the time Clara was born, he had built one of the most respected independent trading houses on the eastern seaboard. He was not a flashy man. He was the kind of man who understood, down to the bone, how commerce actually works, how routes are established, how relationships are built, how a deal is structured so that both parties walk away wanting to do the next one. He taught his daughter to read a ledger before she could read a novel, and he meant no unkindness by it. He had no son, and he was far too clear-eyed a man to let a gift like Clara's go to waste on the wrong education. By the time she was 23, Miss Clara Finch could negotiate a cargo contract, identify a fraudulent invoice at 40 paces, and tell you within 10 minutes of conversation whether a trading partner would honor their commitment or find a reason not to. She had a gift for people, not the performance of it, but the real thing. The ability to see what someone actually needed and find the arrangement that gave it to them. Her father watched her work and told her she had the sharpest merchant's mind he'd ever raised, and he said it the way he said everything he meant, which was plainly and without decoration. And then Samuel Finch died and left his daughter his entire estate, and the world came for her. An unmarried young woman with a substantial fortune in 1820 was a thing the world on both sides of the Atlantic found very difficult to leave alone. There were connections, useful introductions, a distant cousin with English contacts who saw opportunity and arranged a meeting. Lord Callum Westerby, Viscount of Ravenscroft, was in America on matters of business. He was 34, handsome in a severe way, possessed of an ancient title and a set of English estates that were beneath their considerable grandeur, bleeding money at a rate his careful management had slowed but not stopped. He needed capital. Clara Finch had capital. The bargain was struck the way, such bargains always are, by people who believed they were acting reasonably in a reasonable world. Clara, still numb from grief, still standing in the strange empty space her father's death had made, agreed to a marriage she understood to be a transaction, and told herself she was practical enough to manage it. She was wrong about managing it. Not because she expected too much, but because she had underestimated how much of herself she would be asked to leave at the door. Lord Westerby was not cruel. He was something harder to argue with. Indifferent, he was ashamed of her American accent, her directness, the way she occasionally said what she thought without first running it through the correct social filters. He was ashamed of her father, who had been a merchant, which in Lord Westerby's world sat comfortably below a man who had never worked a day in his life, but owned the right name. He spent her fortune, carefully, gratefully, thoroughly, to shore up his estates, and he looked at her across the dinner table as though she were a necessary but faintly regrettable piece of furniture that had come with the arrangement. He never once asked what she was good at. It did not occur to him to ask. She lived quietly and burned quietly, and watched 2 years of her father's teaching rust inside her for want of any use. And she told herself she was managing, because what else was there to say? And then Lady Annette Carew entered the story, which is where manageable things became unforgivable. Lady Annette Carew was exactly the woman Lord Westerby was supposed to have married, English, well-born, socially impeccable, and privately furious that he had gone to America and come back with a merchant's daughter instead of giving her the proposal she had arranged the better part of a season around expecting. She was patient. She was clever. She had decided that the woman who had taken her place would pay for the taking, and she had begun building her case before the ink was dry on the Westerby marriage certificate. She built her scandal carefully, the way such things are built, out of appearances, not facts. There was a young shipping agent, perfectly innocent, called at the house on legitimate business, and Lady Carew arranged, with bribed servants and forged correspondence, for it to appear that his visits were something other than legitimate. A letter in a hand got up to look like Clara's, a meeting staged to look like a meeting it was not. A whisper placed in the right ear, and then another, and then the slow, unstoppable spread of a thing that cannot be recalled. That Lady Westerby's American upbringing had expressed itself in an American want of discretion. Clara went to her husband. She laid out the truth, calmly, completely, with documentation, the way her father had taught her, because Samuel Finch had believed that evidence was the only argument the world could not dismiss. She had the agent's actual correspondence. She had a timeline that made the accusation impossible. She put it in front of Lord Westerby, and she looked at him, and she said, "This is the truth, and you know me well enough to know it." He did not believe her, or he chose not to, and I want you to hold that distinction carefully, my friends, because it is the whole wound at the center of this story. He had the evidence in his hands, and he set it aside. He looked at his American wife with her direct gaze and her merchant's blood and the easy convenience of a lie that confirmed what his pride already half believed, and he chose the lie. Because it was easier, because believing her would have required standing beside her against people whose opinion mattered more to him than hers. He told himself afterward that he had been deceived. That is not what happened. What happened is that he decided she was not worth the trouble of the truth. He banished her quietly, finally, the way he did everything, without heat, the way one gives instructions for the disposal of something spoiled. He would not divorce her. A divorce carried its own scandal, and besides, her fortune was now threaded through his estates. But she would go north. She would go to Rowanmere, and she would stay, and she would have an allowance to live on, and that was the whole of it. She listened. She did not weep, and she did not argue. She stood very straight, and she said one thing before she walked out. "You have never understood what you married. You are about to." She arrived at Rowanmere in November, in the rain, and it was every bit as dismal as you are imagining. The house was cold and damp and barely maintained. The harbour was half silted. The village was half dead. The people on the road looked at this well-dressed southern woman with the careful, blank expression of folk who have learned not to expect much from anyone who comes from the direction of London. She sat with it for a few weeks. I will not pretend otherwise. She sat with the grief of a wrongful banishment and a marriage that had never given her anything but its name, and some of those weeks were dark. There is no shame in darkness when the darkness has been earned by other people's cruelty. And then she went for a walk. She walked down to the harbour on a grey December morning because she needed air, and she could not bear the house any longer. She stood at the edge of the silted quay and looked at the dying port with her father's eyes, and she stopped grieving and started thinking. Because Miss Clara Finch had been raised by a man who could walk into a failing operation and tell you in 20 minutes exactly why it was failing, and in 20 more what it needed to thrive. That gift had lived in Samuel Finch. It lived in his daughter, and Rowanmere, for all its desolation, was not a hopeless place. It was a place that had been neglected by a sequence of absentee owners who had never troubled to understand what they had. Clara understood. She could see exactly what it wanted. Here is the piece that mattered legally and matters to the story. Samuel Finch's Baltimore lawyers had structured a portion of his estate in Clara's own name before the marriage. At his very deliberate insistence, he had not raised a daughter to business only to leave her defenseless in it. Lord Westerby had his fortune restored. Clara had her own. It was not vast, but she had never needed vast sums to begin. She had needed, as her father always said, a clear eye and a plan. She dredged the harbour first. Hired every able-bodied man in the village who wanted honest wages and put them to it, and worked alongside the engineer she brought from the south, learning the specifics of this harbour the way she had learned everything. By being present, by asking, by paying close attention to what the land and water were actually telling her. She rebuilt the quay. She reorganized the fish-curing operation from the ground, upon methods she had seen her father use with his warehouse operations in Baltimore. She negotiated cargo arrangements with 2 coastal carriers in person across a table at terms that made both parties want to come back. She built the textile works when she realized that the upland farms had wool they couldn't get to market cheaply enough to make the effort worthwhile, and she had a working harbour now, and the solution was so obvious it seemed impossible no one had seen it. Perhaps no one with the knowledge to act on it had ever been left there long enough to look. Within 6 months the harbour was operational. Within a year it was profitable. Within 18 months the people of Rowanmere had stopped wearing that grey, careful look. She did not do it from a distance. She was on the quay in the cold mornings and in the accounts room in the evenings, and she knew every man and woman in the village by name, and knew their families and their troubles and their particular abilities. She paid attention the way her father had paid attention, because good commerce, Samuel Finch had told her 100 times, is not about moving goods. It is about understanding people. It is about knowing what they need before they have found the words for it. They called her Miss Clara. Not her title. She had not asked them to use it, and they had understood instinctively that she meant it. Miss Clara, who came down in the rain to check the morning catch, who could argue a better rate from the cargo agent out of Whitby, who knew to the penny what the cooperage needed and made sure it had it. Miss Clara, whom they would have followed without hesitation, and whose word they trusted without reservation. That is what Lord Westerby found when he rode down from the clifftop into Rowanmere. The cold stares of the village were not lost on him. He knew what he was to these people, the absentee lord who had sent their Miss Clara here to disappear. He rode through those stairs without flinching because he had earned them, and he knew it. She saw him coming while he was still 20 yards from the quay, and gave no sign of it except that her spine went very straight, and she finished the sentence she was saying to the cargo agent before she turned. That alone, the finishing of the sentence, told him more about who she had become than anything he had seen from the clifftop. She looked at him across the dock with 2 years of a life well built behind her eyes, and she said, "Lord Westerby, you have come a long way for a man with no appointment." He had rehearsed a great many things to say on the long ride north. None of them survived the moment, he said. "I have learned the truth about Lady Carew, the whole of it, the forged correspondence, the bribed servants, the staging of it." He paused. "You were innocent. You were innocent from the beginning, and I had the evidence in my hands and I set it aside, because believing you would have cost me something I valued more than you at the time. That is the truth of what I did, and I have no way to dress it into anything better than what it is." Lady Westerby looked at him for a long moment. The harbour moved around them. Ropes, tide, the steady creak of loaded timber, and none of it touched the stillness between them. "You used my money to restore your name," she said, "and then you used my reputation to excuse yourself from me. Is that a fair accounting?" "Yes. And now the harbour accounts have caught your attention." He flinched at that, and she let it sit before she said, more quietly, "Tell me the true reason you came, Lord Westerby. Not the version that speaks well of you." Lord Callum Westerby, Viscount of Ravenscroft, who had spent 40 years behind the armour of his title and the certainty of his own judgment, said, I came because I rode over that hill and I looked down at what you built in the worst place I owned, and I understood, looking at it, that I had discarded the most capable person I have ever known, because I was too proud to look at her honestly. I came because I am ashamed, not of the scandal, of myself, of the man I was when you were my wife. I have not come to take back the harbor or to take back you. I have come because I need you to know that I see it clearly now, all of it. He dismounted. He stood at the bottom of the quay steps and looked up at her. I will go to London, and I will dismantle Lady Carew's scheme before the same world that was told it, he said. Not as a bargain, not in exchange for anything, because it is owed to you, and I should have paid it 2 years ago, and I will pay it now, whether you send me away the moment it is done. Miss Clara Finch studied him for a long moment. He did not look away. He had stopped looking away from things, somewhere on that long road north, and he intended to go on not looking away. You will do it because it is owed, she said at last. Not because it buys you something. Yes. And then whatever you say. She came down the quay steps and stood level with him on the wet stone, and she said, Then do it. Clear my name, and when you have done that, come back here, not as a landlord inspecting his property, as a man who would like to learn what his wife actually knows. A pause. I warn you, Lord Westerby, I am not a patient teacher, and this is not a soft business. You will not understand half of what I do for months, and I will not slow down to accommodate your pride. You will have to leave your pride at the cliff road and come down without it. I understand, he said. I am not certain you do yet, but I think you might given time and honest effort. Something shifted in her, not warmth exactly, but the deliberate opening of a door she had kept shut for 2 years. Go fix what you broke, then come back and we will see whether there is anything here worth building. She gave him one more level look, and then she turned back to the harbor and the morning's work. Because there was a cargo manifest that needed her attention and a tide that would not wait for anyone's reckoning. And she was not a woman who let important things go undone. He went. He kept his word. Took the whole of Lady Carew's manufactured scandal before the London world that had believed it and broke it apart, piece by piece, in public without mercy, and when he was finished, Lady Westerby's name was clear, and Lady Carew's was not, which was exactly what justice required and what he should have done 2 years before. And then he rode north again, this time without dread. And he stayed. It took him longer than he had hoped, and considerably less time than he deserved. He learned the harbor from her, not the theory of it, but the actual working of it, cargo by cargo, account by account, the particular human negotiation of each relationship she had built with every merchant and supplier and worker who moved through Rowanmere. He was not a natural. He had been trained his whole life to receive deference, not to earn trust, and there is a distance between those two things as wide and cold as the North Sea. The people of Rowanmere did not give him anything because of his title. They watched, and they waited, and they gave it to him, slowly. In small pieces, as he proved he was not the man who had sent their Miss Clara here to be forgotten. He came to love her, truly and specifically, not as an idea or a category, not as a fortune or remarkable thing he had been too blind to see, but as Clara, who argued with cargo agents before 9 in the morning, and kept her father's old Baltimore ledgers on the shelf above her desk, and had a laugh she reserved for things that were genuinely funny, and rarely wasted time on things that were not. And she came to love him, the way that only happens between people who begin as strangers and build something real on ground that used to be wreckage. Slowly, honestly, with their eyes open the whole time. They ran Rowanmere together, the merchant's daughter and the once proud lord, and they made it something that Samuel Finch, watching from wherever good men watch from, would have recognized as the kind of enterprise he had spent his life building. A place run on clear eyes, honest work, and the particular unrepeatable knowledge of a woman who had been handed a ruin and understood, down to her bones, how to make it bloom. Lord Westerby, who had spent his whole life proud of a name he had done nothing to earn, lived to be prouder of the harbour his wife built than of anything the Ravenscroft title had ever given him. He said so, plainly, to anyone who asked, and he meant it the way a man means something when it has cost him enough to teach him its value. You cannot bury a person who carries their purpose inside them, my dear friends. You can send them to the edges of the map, and they will find the work waiting there, the same as it was anywhere else. The work does not care where you are. The gift does not diminish because someone decided it was inconvenient. Subscribe to Moonlight at Marlowe if tonight has given you something worth having. Come back to the fire. There are more of these stories waiting. More people who were handed the worst and understood what to do with it, and I would not have you miss a single one. Good night. And if the world has ever tried to bury you somewhere quiet and forgotten, look around carefully before you grieve. You may find it has handed you exactly the work you were built for.